Patricia Wilson's manicured fingers tightened around her iPhone 14 Pro Max as she spoke urgently to the 911 operator, her voice rising with each carefully enunciated word. "There's a suspicious young black male loitering in Riverside Park. He's been here for hours, and I'm concerned about the safety of our children." The conviction in her tone was unmistakable as she stood there in her Lululemon yoga outfit, designer sunglasses perched on her nose, watching the 16-year-old black teenager who remained unaware of the brewing storm. The screech of tires cut through the peaceful afternoon air as a black SUV with government plates came to an abrupt halt at the park's entrance, drawing all eyes to the commanding figure stepping out. Dr. Michelle Johnson, the city's first black female mayor, emerged from the vehicle, her face a mask of controlled rage that sent shivers through the growing crowd of onlookers. Her Hermes blazer caught the late afternoon sun as she strode purposefully toward the scene, her voice cutting through the tension like a steel blade. "The suspicious teenager, your reporting is my son." At that moment, Patricia's certainty crumbled, her designer handbag slipping from her shoulder as the weight of her grave mistake settled over the park like a heavy cloud. This would be a mistake with repercussions far beyond their affluent community's carefully manicured borders. Hey family, before we dive deeper into this powerful story that captures the reality of racial profiling in America, take a moment to hit that subscribe button and turn on your notification bell. These are the stories that need to be heard, the conversations that need to be had, and the changes that need to be made. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. We're building a community of changemakers here, and your voice matters. Now let's rewind to how this all began. The spring afternoon at Riverside Park had started peacefully enough. Sunlight filtered through the fresh leaves of ancient oak trees, casting dancing shadows on the newly mowed grass below. Marcus Johnson sat against his favorite oak, a worn copy of The Hate U Give resting in his hands, his Yale sweatshirt, a gift from his mother, hanging loosely on his athletic frame. He'd always found solace in this quiet corner of the park, especially on Saturday afternoons when his mother attended her monthly community meetings. The familiar scent of blooming cherry blossoms mingled with freshly cut grass, creating the perfect backdrop for his reading session. His phone buzzed with a text from his mother, promising to pick him up in 30 minutes. Across the park's winding path, Patricia Wilson's attention was drawn away from her neighborhood watch group's WhatsApp chat by the solitary figure under the oak tree. She'd lived in this neighborhood for 20 years, priding herself on knowing every regular face. This one, she decided, didn't belong. The sun continued its lazy descent in the spring sky, unaware that its warm rays were about to illuminate a scene that would force this community to confront its deepest-seated prejudices. Patricia's steps were measured as she approached, her designer heels clicking against the park's paved pathway. Each step drew her closer to a confrontation that would expose not just her own biases, but the underlying tensions that coursed through their supposedly progressive community. Marcus marked his page with a leather bookmark embossed with the words, "Knowledge is power," unaware that he was about to become an unwitting participant in a lesson far more immediate than anything contained within the pages of his book. The peaceful bubble of his reading sanctuary was about to burst, transforming an ordinary Saturday afternoon into a moment that would resonate far beyond Riverside Park's carefully maintained borders. The stage was set for a confrontation that would force this affluent community to face its uncomfortable truths, all beginning with 5 words that would shatter the tranquil afternoon. "Excuse me, what are you doing here?" The sunlight that had seemed so warm and welcoming just moments ago now felt harsh and exposing as Patricia Wilson took another step toward Marcus, her shadow falling across his book. Her approach carried the weight of 20 years of self-appointed neighborhood surveillance, each click of her heels against the pavement echoing with misplaced authority. "Excuse me." Patricia's voice carried that particular tone of forced politeness that barely masked underlying hostility. "What exactly are you doing here? This is a family park." The emphasis she placed on family hung in the air like a toxic cloud, its implications clear as day. Marcus looked up from his book, his heart rate quickening slightly though his expression remained carefully neutral. Years of his mother's guidance echoed in his mind. Always stay calm, always stay dignified, never give them a reason. He marked his page deliberately, his movements measured and careful. "Good afternoon, ma'am," Marcus responded, his voice steady and clear, just as his mother had taught him. "I'm just reading while waiting for my ride." He held up The Hate U Give, its cover visible in the afternoon light. The irony of the moment wasn't lost on him. Patricia's French manicured fingers tightened around her phone, her Gucci sunglasses doing little to hide the skepticism in her eyes. "Reading? For hours." Her voice dripped with disbelief. "I've been watching you, and you've been here since lunchtime. That's suspicious behavior." A small group of park-goers had begun to take notice of the interaction, some slowing their walks or pausing their conversations to observe. Marcus felt their eyes on him, the weight of their attention making his skin prickle. He'd been in situations like this before. The unwanted scrutiny, the presumption of guilt, but knowledge didn't make it any easier to bear. "Ma'am," Marcus began again, fighting to keep his voice level, "I have every right to be here. This is a public park." He gestured to his book and the small stack of SAT prep materials beside him. "I'm studying. That's all." Patricia's posture stiffened, affronted by what she perceived as defiance. Her perfectly lined lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line. "Don't take that tone with me, young man. I'm part of the neighborhood watch, and we take safety very seriously here." She emphasized here, as if it were a private kingdom rather than a public space. Marcus felt a familiar knot forming in his stomach. He thought about texting his mother but decided against it. She was in an important community meeting, and he'd been taught to handle situations like this. Still, his fingers instinctively moved toward his phone. "Don't even think about it," Patricia snapped, misinterpreting his movement. "I've seen how these things go. You're not calling for backup." She took half a step backward, her free hand clutching her designer handbag closer to her body, a gesture that spoke volumes about her prejudices. The absurdity of her assumption might have been laughable if it weren't so painful. Marcus, a 16-year-old honor student wearing a Yale sweatshirt, somehow transformed through her biased lens into a threat requiring immediate action. "Ma'am, I think there's been a misunderstanding." Marcus tried one more time, his voice steady despite the tremor he felt building inside. "I'm just a student waiting for my ride. I come here often to read." He gestured to his belongings, all neatly arranged, his water bottle from the school debate team, his advanced placement study guides visible beside him. But Patricia had already made up her mind. Her fingers moved across her phone screen with practiced efficiency. "I'm sorry, but if you have nothing to hide, you won't mind waiting while I call someone to check this out." She took another step back, her voice rising slightly as she dialed 911. Marcus felt his heart rate spike. Everything his mother had warned him about, everything they'd discussed at the dinner table, every news story they'd analyzed together. It was all happening now to him, in broad daylight in an affluent neighborhood park. Around them, the crowd of onlookers had grown. Some had their phones out, recording the interaction. Marcus noticed a middle-aged white woman shaking her head disapprovingly. Though whether at him or Patricia, he couldn't tell. A young couple with a stroller hurried past, pointedly avoiding eye contact. "Yes, hello." Patricia's voice cut through the tension, now speaking into her phone. "I'm at Riverside Park, and there's a situation that requires attention." She turned slightly away from Marcus, but kept him in her peripheral vision. "There's a young black male who's been loitering for hours. He's being confrontational, and I'm concerned for public safety." Marcus sat perfectly still, his hands visible, his breathing carefully controlled. Every lesson his mother had taught him about surviving such encounters played through his mind like a well-rehearsed script. "Don't make sudden movements. Keep your hands where they can be seen. Stay calm. Document everything." The sound of approaching sirens in the distance made his stomach drop. This was no longer just an uncomfortable confrontation. It was escalating into something potentially dangerous. Marcus thought of his mother, Dr. Michelle Johnson, the mayor of their city, sitting in her community meeting less than a mile away, unaware that her son was about to become another statistic, another story, another example of what she fought against every day. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the park as two police cruisers approached, their lights painting the scene in alternating flashes of red and blue. As they pulled up to the curb, Marcus could see the curious faces of children on the nearby playground, their games forgotten as they watched the drama unfold. Patricia stood straighter, a look of satisfaction crossing her face as the police officers emerged from their vehicles. Marcus remained seated, his heart pounding but his exterior calm, knowing that the next few moments could change or end his life. The first officer, his hand resting casually on his holster, began walking toward them. "Dispatch mentioned a disturbance," he called out, his eyes scanning the scene. "What seems to be the problem here?" As Patricia opened her mouth to respond, none of them noticed the black government SUV turning into the park's entrance, its arrival about to transform this all-too-familiar scene of racial profiling into something none of them expected. The police cruiser's red and blue lights painted an eerie tableau across Riverside Park as Officer Mike Reynolds, a 15-year veteran of the force, approached the scene with practiced authority. His younger partner, Officer James Carter, flanked him slightly behind, his hand hovering near his body camera, a habit formed from recent sensitivity training. "Ma'am, can you tell us what's going on here?" Officer Reynolds addressed Patricia, his tone already colored by her earlier 911 call description. The setting sun cast long shadows across his badge, number 8294 glinting in the fading light. Patricia stepped forward eagerly, her Gucci sunglasses now perched on top of her head like a crown. "Yes, officer. This young man has been loitering here for hours." She gestured toward Marcus with her manicured hand. "When I approached him about suspicious behavior, he became confrontational." Marcus remained seated, his hands clearly visible on his book, just as his mother had drilled into him countless times. "Sir, I can explain," he began, but Officer Reynolds held up a hand, cutting him off. "We'll get to you in a moment, son," the officer said, his use of son carrying none of the warmth the word might suggest. Officer Carter's expression flickered slightly, noting the teenager's Yale sweatshirt and the neat pile of SAT prep books beside him. A small crowd had gathered at a safe distance, phones raised like modern-day torches, recording everything. The video would later go viral, but none of them knew that yet. Among the onlookers, a young black mother pulled her children closer, her face a map of familiar worry. "He refused to leave when asked," Patricia continued, her voice rising with theatrical concern. "This is a family park, officer. We have children here." She gestured toward the playground, though most parents had already hustled their children away from the scene. Officer Reynolds turned his attention to Marcus, his hand still resting casually on his holster. "ID," he demanded. "Sir, I'm 16, Marcus replied steadily, though his heart hammered against his ribs. "I don't have a driver's license yet, but I can call my mother." No sudden movements. Officer Reynolds barked as Marcus's hand moved toward his phone. Officer Carter stepped forward, finally speaking up. "Hey, let's all stay calm here," the younger officer suggested, his eyes scanning the growing crowd of onlookers. "Young man, can you explain why you're here?" Before Marcus could answer, the distinctive rumble of a powerful engine cut through the tension. A black government-issued SUV swept into the park entrance, its tinted windows reflecting the early evening light. The crowd parted instinctively as the vehicle came to a precise stop behind the police cruisers. Patricia's expression of smug satisfaction began to falter as the SUV's driver's door opened. Dr. Michelle Johnson emerged, her 5 feet 9 inches frame made even more imposing by her Louboutin heels and the quiet fury radiating from every movement. Her tailored blazer caught the last rays of sunlight as she strode toward the scene, her presence immediately commanding attention. The mayor's security detail moved to follow her, but she waved them back with a subtle gesture. This was personal. Officer Reynolds' spine stiffened as recognition dawned. Officer Carter took an unconscious step backward. Patricia's face, already pale, went absolutely white. "Officers," Dr. Johnson's voice cut through the park like a precision instrument, measured but sharp enough to draw blood. "Would someone care to explain why you're questioning my son?" The word son hung in the air like a thunderclap. Patricia's designer handbag slipped from her shoulder, hitting the ground with a dull thud that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. "Mayor Johnson," Officer Reynolds managed, his hand finally leaving his holster. "We were responding to a call about a suspicious." "Suspicious?" Dr. Johnson interrupted, her eyebrow arching with deadly precision. "Please, Officer Reynolds, do enlighten me. What exactly was suspicious about my 16-year-old honor student son reading in a public park?" She turned to Patricia, who seemed to be trying to physically shrink into her Lululemon outfit. Or perhaps Mrs. Wilson could explain what made her feel threatened enough to call 911 on a teenager doing his SAT prep? The fact that she knew Patricia's name sent a visible shiver through the woman. Mayor Johnson had always made it a point to know every member of her community, especially those who attended city council meetings to oppose her initiatives. I didn't know he was your son," Patricia stammered, her words falling flat in the heavy air. "And that makes it acceptable?" Dr. Johnson's voice remained perfectly modulated, yet seemed to fill the entire park. "Would this situation be any different if he were someone else's son? Any less horrifying if he weren't the mayor's child?" Marcus slowly stood up, gathering his books with deliberate movements. The copy of The Hate You Give sat on top of the pile, its title clearly visible to everyone in the growing circle of onlookers. "Mom," he said quietly, his voice carrying in the silence. I'm okay. Dr. Johnson's expression softened for a moment as she looked at her son, pride mixing with pain in her eyes. Then she turned back to the officers and Patricia, her face resuming its mask of controlled fury. Officer Reynolds, I trust you'll be updating your report to reflect that no crime was committed here, unless we're counting wasting police resources and racial profiling. She paused, letting her words sink in. And Mrs. Wilson, I believe we'll be having a longer conversation about this incident at the next City Council meeting. This is exactly why we've been pushing for anti-bias training in our community. The crowd of onlookers had grown larger, many still recording. Some were already posting the videos online where they would soon go viral. Mayor catches Karen calling cops on her son for reading in park. Patricia opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again. I was just trying to protect. Protect what exactly? Dr. Johnson cut her off. Your privilege? Your assumptions? Because you certainly weren't protecting this community. You put my son's life at risk because you couldn't imagine that a young black man reading in a park might simply be reading in a park. The mayor turned to address the gathering crowd, her voice carrying with the practiced ease of a seasoned public speaker. Let this be a teaching moment for our city. This is why we march. This is why we fight for change. This is why the work isn't done. She placed a protective arm around Marcus's shoulders. And this is why I've always told you, she said to him, though her words carried to everyone present. That knowledge is both your armor and your weapon. Never let anyone make you feel like you don't belong. As they walked toward the SUV, leaving behind a thoroughly chastened Patricia and two uncomfortably shifting police officers, the setting sun painted the sky in shades of purple and orange. The scene would be replayed thousands of times on social media, becoming a viral moment that sparked yet another national conversation about racial profiling and privilege. But for Marcus and his mother, it was something far more personal. Another reminder of why their fight for justice had to continue, one park bench, one prejudiced assumption, one small victory at a time. The videos hit social media before Dr. Michelle Johnson's government SUV had even left Riverside Park. Within hours, the hashtag #ReadingWhileBlack was trending nationwide, accompanied by the viral footage of a mayor confronting racial profiling in her own community. But this was more than just another viral moment. It was a catalyst for change that would ripple through the city and beyond. 3 days after the incident, the grand marble steps of City Hall buzzed with activity. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the clear blue sky like metal sunflowers. Dr. Johnson stood at the podium, her presence commanding as always, though those who knew her well could see the weight of the past few days in her eyes. What happened to my son in Riverside Park, she began, her voice carrying across the crowded plaza, is not unique. It's not extraordinary. And that's exactly why we're here today. She paused, letting the words sink in. The only thing extraordinary about this incident is that it happened to someone with enough power to make it a teaching moment. Marcus sat in the front row, still in his Yale sweatshirt, now a symbol of resilience that had sparked its own social media movement. Next to him, his debate team wore matching sweatshirts in solidarity. Their coach, Mr. Thompson, had tears in his eyes as he watched his star debater become the unwitting face of a movement. Today, Dr. Johnson continued, I'm not speaking just as your mayor. I'm speaking as a mother who had to teach her son that reading in a park could be dangerous because of the color of his skin. I'm speaking as a black woman who knows that my title, my education, and my position didn't protect my child from racial profiling. In the crowd, Patricia Wilson stood near the back, her designer clothes exchanged for a more subdued outfit. The past 3 days had been a brutal education in privilege and prejudice. Her face had been plastered across social media, her actions dissected by national news commentators. She'd received death threats, but also something more challenging. Hundreds of messages from black mothers sharing their own stories of fear for their children. Therefore, the mayor's voice grew stronger. I'm announcing 3 immediate policy changes. She held up one finger. First, our police department will undergo mandatory comprehensive anti-bias training, developed in partnership with civil rights experts and community leaders. Officer Carter, standing at attention near the steps, nodded slightly. He'd already volunteered to be part of the pilot program. Second, another finger rose. We're establishing a community oversight board with real power to review police responses to 911 calls and identify patterns of discriminatory reporting. The crowd murmured. This was more than just talk. This was structural change. And third, Dr. Johnson's voice softened slightly as she looked at her son. We're launching an education initiative in our schools and community centers, teaching young people about their rights, their worth, and their role in building a more just society." The applause was thunderous, but Dr. Johnson raised her hand for silence. "But policy changes aren't enough. We need to change hearts and minds. And sometimes that starts with admitting our own mistakes." To everyone's surprise, Patricia Wilson began moving through the crowd toward the podium. This wasn't planned, and the mayor's security detail tensed. But Dr. Johnson nodded, understanding the moment's importance. Patricia's hands trembled as she approached the microphone. Gone was the entitled confidence of the Neighborhood Watch volunteer. In its place was a woman who had been forced to confront her own biases in the most public way possible. "I was wrong," her voice cracked slightly. "Not just about Marcus, but about every assumption I've made about who belongs where." She turned to face the crowd. "I've spent the past 3 days reading every message sent to me, watching every video shared with me, and learning about what Black parents have to teach their children. I can't undo what I did, but I can commit to doing better." The silence that followed was profound. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, a single thank you rang out. It came from the same Black mother who had pulled her children close in the park, and it carried the weight of generations. Marcus stood up, walking to join his mother at the podium. The contrast was striking. The poised, powerful mayor and her teenage son, both wearing the weight of this moment with dignity. Change, Marcus spoke for the first time since the incident, his voice clear and strong, doesn't always come from grand gestures. Sometimes it comes from a book, a park bench, and the courage to face uncomfortable truths. He pulled his copy of The Hate You Give from his backpack, holding it up for the crowd to see. "My mom always told me that knowledge is power. But now I understand that knowledge also comes with responsibility. The responsibility to speak up, to stand firm, and to help others learn and grow." Dr. Johnson wrapped an arm around her son's shoulders, maternal pride momentarily overshadowing mayoral authority. "This incident could have ended very differently," she said softly into the microphone. "Instead, we're turning it into a beginning rather than an ending." As the crowd dispersed, the steps of City Hall became a spontaneous forum. People gathered in small groups, sharing stories, exchanging contact information, making plans for community action. Local bookstores reported selling out of The Hate You Give and other books about racial justice. The evening news would show footage of something remarkable. Patricia Wilson sitting with a group of Black mothers, listening to their stories, her designer handbag replaced by a notebook full of community meeting dates. Officer Carter leading a discussion with his fellow officers about implementing the new training protocols. And Marcus, surrounded by his debate team, planning a student-led series of discussions about privilege and prejudice. As the sun set behind City Hall, casting long shadows across the plaza, Dr. Johnson stood watching the impromptu gatherings. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from mayors across the country, asking for details about the new policies. The incident in Riverside Park had become more than a viral video. It was becoming a blueprint for change. "Mom," Marcus said quietly, standing beside her, "do you think this will really make a difference?" Dr. Johnson looked at her son, seeing both the child she needed to protect and the young man who was helping to change their community. "Change is like reading, honey," she replied. "It happens one page at a time, but every page matters." The story spread far beyond their city, but its real impact was felt in the small moments. A white woman smiling at a Black teenager reading in the park, a police officer taking an extra moment to question his assumptions, a community learning to see itself more clearly in the mirror of its own prejudices. As your storytellers, we remind you that these moments of change happen every day, in parks and streets across America. By sharing these stories, we become part of the change. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell to join our community of storytellers and changemakers. Leave a comment telling us about similar experiences in your community. Your voice matters in this ongoing conversation. Stories like Marcus and Dr. Johnson's remind us that change begins with awareness and ends with action. Every view, every share, every conversation sparked becomes part of a larger movement toward justice and understanding. By subscribing, you're not just watching, you're becoming part of a movement that values authentic stories and real change. Make us part of your daily routine and let every story count. Subscribe and join us daily for stories that make a difference. Together, we can turn moments of prejudice into opportunities for progress, one story at a time. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and bell notification to stay updated with more powerful stories that need to be told. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Your voice and your perspective matter in this ongoing journey of change. Remember, stories don't just tell us about the world, they help us change it.